Hello, everyone. This is just a quick introduction on defining what sociology is and the three kind of different theories that kind of guide a lot of sociological um, investigation. And so we'll begin with just defining sociology, and it can be defined in kind of three ways. As one, it's the study of a society. So it's the study of cultural and social systems that all integrate into one that includes the integration of the purpose of things like education, the purpose of legal systems, for example, and government, but also institutions such as religion and those, and how those systems come together to create our social systems. It's also a social science that involves the study of the social lives of people, groups, and societies. And so we'll talk about different ways in which people and groups and society live together, and even do some cross comparisons between different societies and groups. The other thing is that it's a scientific study of the social aggregate, the entities through which humans move throughout their lives. And so this is the basic definition, and what it really comes back down to is sociology is the study of people as they're moving through the world in which we exist. And when we look at where sociology sits in the broader social sciences, we can see it kind of on a hierarchy, if you want to put it that way, with anthropology. Which anthropology is the study of the overarching themes of how people live or lived. So a lot of anthropologists look at kind of how peoples in ancient societies lived, and they kind of can compare to how we live today and how we existed. Mainly more on the more cultural level is a study of the anthropology. And then if we get down to the bottom in psychology is a study of individual behaviors and mental processes. So psychologists is more concerned with brain processes and how they elicit behaviors. They're more concerned about how a individual responds to a social context for a system, and how people are influenced by social information, and how people then influence that social information. Sociology sits kind of in the middle, where what we're most concerned with is how social systems influence one culture, okay, so the anthropological level, but then how social systems influence people, and not so much the individual, but people within certain groups or within certain systems. Now, this is just more of an academic differentiation. In reality, all three of these different social sciences use each other. Again, when I think about my academic work in dealing with things like identity and people identity, a lot of the theories that I use come from a sociological perspective, not so much a psychological perspective. So we kind of trade and use each other's knowledge in our own studies and our own understanding of what we want to know. So just a quick picture, I think. So the thing that sociologists have come to discover is that regardless of any group, whether we're talking about a small group of individuals, let's say a work group at a job site, or if we're talking about a community, if we're talking about family, if we're talking about an entire state or entire country, there always tends to be two reoccurring themes that exist within any of these social structures. One is consensus, and that's all groups are guided by some type of shared norms and values that guide their behavior. If we think about, culture, for example, tends to be a norm or a value for a certain group. If we think about at work, there's certain things we do and there's certain things we don't do, and sometimes they're written, right? But sometimes they're just socially understood. And so we'll get into this more specifically, but consensus tends to be one reoccurring theme within groups. The other one is, regardless of the group, is conflict. Inequality and power differences seem to always exist within some group. We can think about life and death differences, for example. And so consensus and conflict, you can say, can be destructive or that can be constructive. We know through conflict, we can't grow without conflict. But we can also be inhibited by consensus, which then can create conflict, if that makes sense. So those two kind of forces drive are common in all types of groups. So, and then there's theories that often drive sociological inquiry. If there's one difference between maybe sociology versus what you would say psychology, or maybe even anthropology, is it's really theory driven. And so they use theory to try and understand groups, which in a way makes sense because groups are very complex and you need some type of structure to investigate them. And I do have to say, sociology really needs more added input into theory because what we have currently is mostly just a Western perspective on social systems and whatnot. And so this field definitely has some growth to do. I'm going to just put that out there. And many of the sociological societies have recently admitted to that it lacks a lot of what's called minority voices, because we know that minorities, especially here in the United States, are the fastest growing group, but that tends to be that voice, that scientific voice tends to be missing in a lot of sociological writing. So we'll talk about that as we move along in this class. So again, sociology was founded on an Anglo-European idea. It's a reductionist idea where things needs to be reduced to their most simple element. And the challenge is when going through these theories is it's important to ask whether these theories fit with, in our case, because we are a tribal college where we promote tribal entity, is does it take into the indigenous perspective or does it differ? And in this investigation, there will be no right or wrong answer. So as we move along in this class, we'll want to question, does this fit your Native American or indigenous view of the world? And I say yours because you can't pigeonhole Native Americans into one specific mindset or one perspective, certain perspective. We have learned that every Native American tribe, while there's some common themes, there tends to be always a difference in the view of the world or the view of how things are working. So I specifically state that it needs to come from your Native American experience. So what are these sociological theories that tend to drive a lot of investigation within the field of sociology? And there's three theories, and they all have a different level of analysis and focus. When we're talking about macro level, we're talking about overall functioning of a society. When we're talking about the micro level, we're really talking about one-on-one interaction within a social system. How one person, for example, can communicate with another about things, about the group, or about that social system. The first one is structural versus functionalism, or structural functionalism. And that's a way each part of society functions together to contribute to the whole. So this is how does the legal system, the education system, the religious systems function in order to help a society move forward. And that really gets to, again, that consensus part that we just talked about, that very common theme about consensus. And then we have conflict theory, which again is a macro level theory, and this is the way inequalities contribute to social differences and perpetuate differences in power. And again, this gets to the conflict side of the common themes of sociology. And then we have symbolic interactionalism. This is the way individuals communicate their social norms or their conflicts within a society, and what is permissible as far as interaction and symbolic. If we want to think about this is writing, this is speaking, this is language, this is all of those things, and we'll see how societies can use it to bend a society's perception, or it can be used to create effective growth within a social group as we move through this class. So let's talk a little bit about these different theories. When we talk about structural functional, we want to examine how social structures function in order to meet certain social needs. And we ask the question, what structures exist and are they functioning properly to create a good social system? And we can look at two kind of theorists to look at structural and functional ideas. Structural functional theory started with a person named Herbert Spencer. And what he saw is similarities between the human biological processes and societies. And what he argued is that a social institution functions just like the organs of a body. So you have a heart system, you have an immune system. If we kind of want to compare these, maybe the heart system is likened to the transportation systems. If we put it on a emotional level, maybe it's the religious or spiritual side. The immune system is much like our legal system. Our protective systems, our brain is much like our educational systems. And he made these similarities, and he argued that social systems are very much a human entity. It's part of human existence because it's modeled exactly after the human system as a biological system. And then we have Emil Durkheim. Using Spencer's ideas of the system, Durkheim wanted to know how societies and people change over time. And really what he wants to know is what the purpose of society was to maintain what we call a dynamic equilibrium. Because again, if we go back to the biological system as an analogy to social systems, our biological system aims towards equilibrium. It aims towards a balance between, for example, high blood pressure and low blood pressure as an example. It maintains to equalize heartbeat and body temperature, and everything tries to be at an equal point. And using this idea of the biological system, what Durkheim wanted to know is, how do social systems create equilibrium within a social system? And he says it does this by developing what are called social facts. And social facts for him include things like laws, morals, values, religious beliefs, customs, fashions, and rituals. The reason why these are called social facts isn't just because, a law, for example, here in the United States, shouldn't necessarily be considered a fact. But what he's saying is that we find all of these within any social system, within any social society or culture. You will find things like laws, morals, values, religious beliefs, customs, fashions, and rituals. And these tend to be facts of any type of social system. And then we get to Robert Merton, who wants to know now, so those structures and functions exist. Then we want to get into more of how these processes have multiple functions. So he came up with 3 terms, what the manifest function of is, and that's the consequences of social processes, that were sought or anticipated. And then we look at the latent function. What are the unsought consequences of a social process? And the dysfunctions. What are the undesirable social consequences? And we find this within any type of system rule. And if we look at, for example, laws, a law may seem good to protect a society, but we know that within any law there's some latent function. So here in the United States, an unsought consequences of receiving legal action, for example, is a loss of a job. That's not necessarily the purpose of arresting somebody for breaking that law, but that tends to be an unsought consequences. And then undesirable social consequences. I could see loss of job, but that's more of a latent function. Dysfunctions are more things like the unfair distribution of a law. So, here in the United States, if you're black, you're more likely to be arrested than if you're white, as an example. Those are undesirable social consequences. Okay, so those are the ideas behind structural functional, and you kind of keep that body system, that equilibrium idea in mind, and then understanding that within any system there's going to be a manifest, what the purpose or what the anticipated one. There's the latent function, which is the unsought consequences, and then there's the dysfunction. And in any social system, in any social process, to a law, to an educational system, there exist these three different types of functions. And then we have conflict theory, which again goes back to that other common or known process that every system has, which is conflict. And really, conflict theory is just based on this idea that we live in a world that has limited resources. There's limited resources for us for food, shelter, even things like procreation, all of those things. And what conflict theory recognizes is as human populations grow, it creates competition for these resources. And that this competition creates what we call the class systems of those who have, those who produce, and those who don't have. So we can think about this is in the United States. If we want to think about this is the people on Wall Street. Those are the people who have. Those people who are produced, those are the people on that quote unquote in the news. They talk about Main Street America, right? Those are the people who are actually working and producing. And then there's the people who do not have. And this is individuals who are in the lower working class. They're trying to produce, but those different systems don't allow them. We can talk about unemployment. We can talk about impoverished. We can talk about homelessness when it comes to those who do not have. Okay? And because of the limited resource and increased competition, these three class systems will always exist. And then we have this then creates social institutions are reflections of this competition. So we see legal systems trying to balance this out or trying to even create more divisiveness and more separation between these class systems. And really, if we were to summarize what conflict theory is trying to do, is it highlights the issue of power and power dynamics within any given group. And so when we look at these different sociological topics through this course, we'll look at this. So we'll look at the function and the structures that exist within them, but then we will look at the power dynamic that exists within all of these systems. And when we talk about different conflict theories, we can think about a person named Karl Marx. He was probably one of our modern philosophers who objectively categorized social classes in Europe. And he was bothered by how those who have tend to exploit those who do not have. And he believed that the purpose of a social institution should be focused on reducing the exploitation of the lower class. And we'll get more into Karl Marx as we move forward. I think he has a bad rap as far as United States perceptions of him. But as we'll see, that even within the United States, our social systems try to at least address this, probably very poorly, but we'll talk about it as we move forward. Based on Marx and on the development of conflict theory, we then result in 4 basic principles. 1, conflict is inevitable. 2, there is an unequal distribution of powers in a relationship because of this conflict, and there will always be an ongoing struggle for scarce resources. And 4th is whoever has the most power controls the distribution of those resources. So those are the 4 basic principles of conflict theory. And so that's another set that we'll need to add into our analysis of all the different social systems and sociological ideas that we'll talk about in this course. The last one is we got to talk about how these morals and ideas and laws and spirituality, and how are these transmitted through these different power systems. And we do this through a theory known as Symbolic Interactionism. And this is, again, a micro-level theory that focuses on the relationship between society and the individual via the use of language and symbols. It also means that the interaction notes that individuals actively shape society and not just passive respondents. And the example I have here is there are assumptions that we don't, such as Tide Pod eating, and that we do, though, and we'll see in this class how you as an individual can actively help shape the way society should be, and that we're just not passive respondents. And this is, we think about people who believe in, for example, voting for not voting. People who think that their vote doesn't matter. They're more of that passive person. They're letting society happen to them, versus those who believe in the voting process, actually feel like they actively do shape society and have a say in it. And then we'll talk about something called constructionism, how society tries to control social interactions. And, probably one here that is a buzzword for probably the last decade here in the United States is this idea of political correctness. And that there's things that we should say and we should not say. And really social systems, this is where we can start talking about things, other social systems such as social media and stuff, try to shape people into the way that they view that interaction should be occurring. All right, and we'll get to this stuff next week. This is just an introduction to these different theories, providing definition, but these are different examples of symbolic interaction, way societies have used it. And we can see, in propaganda, the view of the enemies and whatnot, and we can look through this, and we'll go through these and kind of go through these next week and see how they help shape the views of individuals. And so this is where I want to end today for your post. And remember to read chapter 1, do the short quiz, give me your reflection on these different theories, and we will see you next week.